Gary Stevenson publicly backed the Greens this weekend. Let's have a look.
If you want to stop inequality from growing, if you want to stop living standards from falling, I think this week you need to vote for the Green Party. And I've got my postal vote here, which I will be sending after this. My post vote, I'll be out voting for the Green Party. I think this is, it's pretty obvious why I've done this. We have one political party in this country which is really strongly advocating for wealth taxes. We have a government which really has just really given me no indication that they will ever be serious and even considering wealth taxes. They've been quite reluctant to talk to me about policy. So it is with a little bit of a heavy heart, because I would have loved to have a little bit more involvement. But the fact is, if you want wealth taxes in England in particular, the only way that you can indicate that to the Labour Party, who are the party in government, is to vote the Greens this week. So I would strongly advocate you to vote for Greens, and I will be voting Greens this week on Thursday.
Critics immediately rushed to dismiss Gary, of course, and who he is. Now, beforehand, everyone was kind of backing this guy, and now all of a sudden, they're considering him through this lens. Charlotte Gill said, "Lol, I told you. Gary Stevenson's a propagandist for the Green Red Alliance, same as Zoe Gardner, Faiza Shaheen, and Grace Blakely. They all went through the Soros-funded school, quote-unquote, the New Economy Organisers Network, chosen because they were young and were deemed as good advertisements to the target vote, meant to look organic, like they naturally came to the conclusion that wealth taxes and green policies are the answer. This movement is so unbelievably artificial." My video from October last year, Gary Stevenson's part of a propaganda network for international socialism. Insane, right? Christopher Snowdon from the libertarian think tank for the Institute of Economic Affairs, who still won't reveal who funds them, said this: "Some have questioned his business acumen, but Gary Stevenson makes at least £127,260 a year from complaining about inequality on his Patreon." Gary Stevenson is a tool, does not understand basic economics. No wonder he is voting Green. Peter McCormack, right-wing podcast host, tweeted this: "Incentives matter. Gary admitted on Piers Morgan that he'd made around £2 million as a trader. This may seem like a lot of money, but it's not retirement money on the lifestyle he'll maintain. Gary needs to sell books and awareness. He spotted a vulnerability with a particular group, so he sells emotional-based economics. It isn't actually economics, it's whinging and victim culture. His answers come down to socialism, but socialism harms the people he claims to want to help. Gary is wrong. Don't be a Gary." This is so fucking laughable. So laughable. Look at how quick they are to dismiss him. And I remember Curtis and I did a video on this last year, and we had said loads of people are going to come out and be like, "Gary Stevenson's a communist. He's a socialist." Like, no, he fucking isn't. Wealth taxes, by the way, like, not even a socialist idea, to be honest with you. It genuinely just would make more sense if you actually care about the rising inequality that's happening in this country. Who would disagree with that? For years, Gary's been making the same argument that inequality is the defining economic crisis of our time, and it fucking is. Look at how many people are struggling. 1 in 3 kids, I have to keep saying this every time I'm on the show, 1 in 3 kids are living in poverty. That wealth concentration completely distorts democracy, housing, wages, and opportunity. And the most complaining that happens isn't from Gary complaining that wealth inequality is so bad and that kids are starving. Please keep complaining about that. If you aren't complaining about that, fucking hell, wake up. Is that the only people I see complaining are the fucking billionaires and millionaires who are sad that they can't concentrate more of their wealth where they need it. Anyway, what I find really irritating about all of this, and none of the things that Gary's saying is new, but notice the timing of this backlash. It's only once Gary aligns himself, even loosely, but not in this case, very strongly, with an electoral vehicle, in this case the Greens and Zach Polanski's redistributive politics, that his economics suddenly becomes dangerous and illiterate and propagandistic. And that tells you that the objection was never really economic when it came to Gary. They'll only ever accept economic critique and treat it as tolerable when it sits in a box that makes it palatable to them, but it becomes intolerable when it threatens to organise itself into votes for parties that I think go against the status quo and actually want to sort out wealth inequality. So who would have thought that this would actually stress them out so much? Curtis, what are your thoughts on all this? I just want to get your reactions. What are your reactions to all of this?
Oh, they're rattled, aren't they? I think that's my favourite line to use when when the right wing throw their toys at the pram. Charlotte Gill, by the way, she's just an utter crank. She keeps on doing these like deep dive conspiracy things, and it's just, oh, nominally left-wing people are linked to left-wing organizations. There's nothing like conspiratorial about it. I mean, you'd be doing something wrong if you didn't do that. Like, that's what organizing like means. Right? To organize, you join a left-wing group and then you meet up with like-minded people. Wow. Both Charlotte Gill and also Peter McCormack, I've had a few run-ins on Twitter with him. Incredibly dense guy. These people keep saying socialism. First of all, Gary Stevenson is not a socialist. He's never once claimed he's a socialist, and wealth taxes are not socialism. This goes to show the depth of their knowledge when it comes to the political economy. What I find incredibly ironic, which is that you always see this thing against people on the left, or people who espouse centre-left economic ideas, is that the left don't understand the economy. They need to go back to school. It's abacus economics. Whilst then going, but by the way, everything is supply and demand. And it's like, okay, but supply and demand is like the first thing you're taught. If that's as far as you go in terms of understanding the economy, then maybe you shouldn't be telling other people that their economics is very childish, because you just keep coming to one thing. The thing is, though, these people like Peter McCormack and stuff, they've never understood the political economy, right? Everyone understands the very basic fundamental inner workings of a market economy. Of course, yes, everyone understands supply and demand. But what they don't look into is the political side. It's like a libertarian who in their minds have this great idea of a society burdened of regulations and rules and freedom. But libertarianism wouldn't work like that. It's the same as neoliberalism. It's like, oh, we cut taxes and regulations, and free businesses and from the shackles of government. People are going to become free. What happened? The wealth just trickled to the top, and inequality has exploded. And we're in the mess today because of the thought process, the very childish thought process of, oh, well, don't worry. If the rich get richer, the wealth will trickle down. That's the difference between like theory brain and practical brain. Of course, we all have our theories. I'm a Marxist, but you also need to apply it in the real world, and you also need to add practical scrutiny. If you simply just say, allow the rich to get rich and scrap taxes or cut taxes and scrap regulation, and then everyone's rich, that's a theory in your mind, which obviously hasn't worked. I mean, we're going to get the world's first trillionaire in terms of Elon Musk, yet food bank usage has gone up. Does that sound like an economy that works? Now, back to the substance of what Gary Stevenson is saying. He's simply talking about wealth taxes. And again, people like Peter McCormack think it's socialism. This is not socialism. This is social democracy, barely. It's about fixing capitalism. Gary Stevenson probably isn't an anti-capitalist. He probably wants to protect capitalism, but he just wants a fairer system. That's it. Now, the point he's making is nothing about whinging or envy. It's about understanding that having a grossly unequal society is bad for society and it's bad for the economy. Because what we have now, the gross levels of inequality, means that the rest of us, that the middle class, are being bought out from basic fundamentals our parents and our grandparents had. What do they have? They managed to get a house. They could get a mortgage. They could pay rent. They could pay bills. And the fundamental things that they enjoyed fairly cheaply, fairly easily, we can't get. Now, why is that happening? It's happening because we've had an explosion of wealth inequality, and the 1%, the 0.1%, are buying up all the assets. And they're doing that because they're not just rich, they're so unbelievably wealthy that all they're doing is just using their existing capital to enrich themselves, but they're using assets to do it. These people today who are super rich, they're not getting rich because they created an amazing product and everyone loves it and people are buying it and that's why. Oh, it's just because capitalism is working. It's not the reason. The reason the rich are getting super rich is because they're using assets and their existing capital to make themselves even richer. The reason why house prices are so expensive is because they've been made scarce. Now, one might say, a free marketeer might say, you just need to build more housing. In 2019, I want to hammer this point. In 2019, we had a record number of houses being built, yet we still had a housing crisis. So the scarcity is manufactured, and that's the way capitalism works, right? Scarcity is manufactured. We do actually have an abundance of things, and more things are becoming very cheap to make. We can build housing very, very quickly, but because it's bought by big property portfolio landlords, it's bought by BlackRock. What they're doing is they're taking out housing, taking it out of the market, and then renting it back to you. The amount of properties that are just being built just to be letted out is crazy. Go on Rightmove, for example, and the amount of listings you'll see, the explosion of listings you'll see, which is just buy to let. So it's not the number of housing, it's the fact that we have housing that's made for not just profit, but for renting, because the capitalist class want you to rent forever. You know, the charge against communism, which is you'll own nothing and you'll be happy, is exactly what's happening under capitalism. Everything is being rented to you, whether it's video games, whether it's Netflix subscriptions. You're now getting like Uber Eats on Klarna, for fuck's sake. Like, we are not living in the type of economy we did before. What we need to do is build council houses, for example. So what Gary Stevenson is saying is, I'm not against people being rich. He himself is rich. I'm not against inequality. He probably doesn't want to make himself poor. What he's saying is the gross levels of inequality we have today is unsustainable. And that is categorically true. Now, it's funny for people like David Priestley, who Gary Stevenson debated. He keeps on jumping in on Gary Stevenson because the only relevant thing he did was debate Gary Stevenson. And all David Priestley, his argument, the thrust of his argument was simply, well, I'm rich and I don't like higher taxes. That was it. Well, of course, if you're a very wealthy person, of course you're going to be against wealth taxes because you're going to be here. Gary Stevenson is very rich and he might be impacted by wealth taxes, yet he supports it anyway. That means he actually has, I don't know, some kind of moral, or he understands the economy. Pointing to the fact that he earns 100 grand a year, I mean, I think he earns more than that. Pointing to the fact that he's a multimillionaire doesn't matter, because if he was poor and talked about inequality, they'd say you're jealous. If you're rich and you talk about inequality, they say you're a hypocrite. So the reality is no one wants to talk about inequality. So Gary Stevenson is absolutely bang on. Now, does that mean, you know, all of his policy prescriptions in every single area is right? Probably not. But when it comes to wealth taxes, like, it's really, really important.
The solution to the housing crisis is actually to abolish landlordism and landlords.
100%.
And I said that the building of council homes and making that a universal thing. And the one thing that I got time and time again was, why don't you just work harder? It's because you're jealous. And I said, you know what? Fuck you. Justify having 5 houses to me? Do one. Fucking boring. You're so right though, because what's missing entirely from the criticisms of those on Twitter, the fucking Gills of the world, is that there's no engagement with the actual analysis of inequality at all. No attempt to challenge the argument that wealth concentrates at the top whilst wages are stagnating below. And there's no serious rebuttal of the idea that Britain's economy has increasingly become an engine of extraction through rents and assets and inherited wealth. Instead, the argument is just, well, Gary attended a training program, a Soros training program, by the way, which is fucking anti-Semitic, insane.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. The left will say the existence of billionaires is wrong. The right says George Soros, and like, you do realize in terms of like the list of billionaires, George Soros is comparatively poor. Like, no one gives a fuck about Elon Musk, and again, he's probably going to be the world's first trillionaire. It's to do with left-wing econ policy, because I've seen lots of people criticize the £15 an hour minimum wage the Greens proposed, and the same types of people like Peter McCormack are like, this guy doesn't understand economics, basic economics. It's supply and demand. And like, again, please study further than your basic definitions. Like, if you're just understanding supply and demand and that's it, I don't think you should be accusing other people of being economically illiterate. Like, look into far more than just that, and then look into political economy. So the £15 an hour minimum wage, absolutely, in isolation, will be difficult for small businesses. Many small businesses are making that much money, and like, usually the biggest expenditure of a business is a wage bill. But this is what people don't talk about, particularly on the right wing, is they never talk about rents and bills. They only talk about business expenditure through the framing of wages and taxes. They'll say, like Adam Brooks goes on GB News and says, we need to just cut VAT and cut national insurance. I'm like, sure. I mean, I'm not particularly against small businesses having reduced business rates. I'm also not against reducing national insurance for businesses, but these are such like small little sticking plaster politics, to borrow Keir Starmer's phrase. One of the biggest expenditures for business is commercial rent. Actually, it's very interesting. I had a debate on GB News with a pub landlord. He wasn't just a pub landlord. He was like some sort of figurehead of a federation of pubs. And it was billed on GB News as a debate. Basically, the stupid left wing and me and this guy who knows what he's talking about in terms of pubs. And they were talking about how Rachel Reeves is increasing taxes on pubs, and that's really, really bad for businesses. I said, look, the problem is that business owners, especially small business owners, face the same problem as individual people, as in rent, right? They have to pay rent. They also have to pay bills. So if you abolish landlords, which is the Green Party policy, imagine if local councils could rent out commercial properties at cost price to businesses. They would save so much money on rent. Because guess what? In a strange world we live in, the capitalist class are fighting among another. You've got the capitalist class who actually produce some kind of social good. You've got pubs who I think are very good for society. That's a social good. That's like the classic capitalism. But then you've got rentier capitalism, which is some other guy or some other company that owns a bunch of properties and are renting those properties to that other person that is at least selling something to the customer. The customer gets a pint or food, gets to enjoy their night. That's a social value in which renting isn't. So I'm like, cut out the middleman when it comes to renting. It's not just about individual people, but commercial landlords too. You save businesses loads of money. And guess what? When I said that on GB News, that pub landlord emailed me afterwards and said, everything you said was right. So it was supposed to be a debate between me and him. And he emailed and said, yeah, there's a massive problem with like corporate landlords. I'm like, yes, but the only political party that's talking about it is the Greens, and Gary Stevenson has just endorsed the Green Party. So you can put this idea out of your head that the Greens are economically illiterate and Gary Stevenson doesn't know what he's talking about. Gary Stevenson and the Greens on the economy are actually saying something worthwhile. We need to break away from this neoliberal austerity crap we've heard from Reform, the Tories, the Labour Party and Lib Dems. The Greens are actually saying something substantive.